I think technology can cut in both directions and both be enormously advancing of rights and agency and also potentially undermining of it. Some people I think often like to kind of fall back on like, oh, well, technology is neutral and it's just how people use it that, has outcomes. I actually don't buy that. I think like most technology out there is purpose built. Right? Like maybe that is in fact what distinguishes like technology from just science, right? Is that there's like it's purpose built. And I think you can't divorce a technology and its tool from, the kind of either intended and unintended purposes behind it. I would like to think that groups of users can have the ability to kind of dictate those outcomes based on the values that they're trying to promote for the purposes of that community. I think to the extent that the ways things are built can facilitate more of that choice, like the better.
Hey, everybody. Excited to welcome Zoe Weinberg on this week's Slow Hunch Pod. Zoe runs a fund called ante, which we've gotten to know well at USV and have co-invested with a few times. And her thesis is investing in tech for human agency. And her hunch that she's been working on is the idea that there'll be stronger and stronger demand for technology that promotes individuals' agency and control over their data, their computing, their information, their digital experience. And it's a really interesting moment to think about how that idea is up for grabs in the midst of a bunch of technological and societal shifts that are all swarming together currently. So very excited to welcome Zoe, and I hope you enjoy. Zoe, welcome to the Slow Hunch podcast. And I've been really looking forward to this conversation. On the ante website, you describe tech for human agency as technology that promotes individuals' agency and control over their privacy, data, assets, and information. That's a really big idea. It's an idea that I think has been a long time coming, and a really complicated idea. So with that, welcome. And maybe you can just introduce yourself and also tell me if that's the right spin on the idea.
Thanks, Nick. And thank you for having me. I definitely believe that the ideas that I'm working on have been a slow hunch, continue to be a slow hunch, are slowly evolving as various hunches. So I like the podcast conception and think it describes what I'm wrestling with. I run an early stage venture fund called ante. And as you said, we invest in technology that either directly or indirectly gives people more control over things like privacy, data, assets, algorithms, the information they consume, and so forth. I think that we really see that as being an important component of the tools that underlie a healthy and functioning democracy. That ultimately, that is the type of technology that will help to advance democratic values in the world and fundamentally helps to address or counterbalance opposing forms of technology that often, manifest as digital authoritarianism, which is a kind of big loaded word that we can talk about, or phrase that we can talk about more, as well as its kind of corporate counterpart, which, you might describe as surveillance capitalism in the words of Shoshana Zuboff, or something along those lines. And, I think when I step back and think about like, what is the purpose of technology more generally, I like to think that the best technology is the tech that makes us more human and makes us more like humans and less like robots. And I think sometimes we actually forget that. I think there's lots of tech that helps us morph ourselves into robots. I'm seeing that more and more these days with like the quantified life as it's manifesting in lots of different corners of our lives. And so I think fundamentally the strategy is a little bit about how do humans interact with technology in a kind of big macro sense? And then also, how does that interact with political systems and how we want to set up society?
It's interesting to hear your description just now because there's let's call it more of a defensive framing, which is we could be headed towards a world that is where technology has more of a digital authoritarian or surveillance capitalist approach. And that's something we need to protect against. And then there's something more of a proactive posture, which is about more like humans and less like robots. I really like that because I, in general, feel like it's important to have positive visions, not just negative visions. But just curious how you think about those two ways of looking at it.
I also feel that way. This is something I've thought about a lot. I used to sort of describe this whole domain of technology as, anti-authoritarian tech, which I never really liked. I will say I liked that it was very specific and addressed something very, kind of concrete. But anti-authoritarian tech does not really roll off the tongue for anyone, and it was negative, and
Right.
I think I agree with you. Like I wanted to think about what is the positive, proactive vision for the future that encapsulates some of the same elements, but is not about purely reacting to the bad or being in a defensive stance, because that I think that's both less inspiring and also more constraining. I kept coming back to I think these concepts around freedom and around agency and around autonomy and potentially around rights. And to me, I think agency sort of felt like the kind of the most purest form of that. That frankly also isn't loaded with the challenges that come with talking about a concept that has a legal framework attached to it, aka rights, right? And so it was important to me to think about like what is the essence, and can we distill that outside of various extrinsic factors that often define these terms.
If you're to think about human agency as expressed through technology and digital tools and experiences, what are the first things that come to mind? What does agency mean for an individual? Why should I care? Why should I be thinking about it?
I think that often it comes down to consent and context, right? I'm not a privacy at all costs type of person. I actually think privacy is the sort of thing that is a societal value that you must think of in the context of its trade-offs with, public safety or with the values of potentially sharing information for the public good. There's lots of trade-offs there, but I think, it sort of comes down to whether or not you have a choice about sharing that information and whether you have the kind of full context to have meaningful consent. And in every instance, some people may choose to share more information or not, or to believe some of the information that they're consuming or choose to reject it. When I think of agency, I think of consent, choice, control, and context, like having the full picture. Now, that is a very consumer oriented way of thinking about technology. I think that's the one that often like clicks or resonates for people initially the most. How that's actually expressed in our investing strategy is often a little bit different. It's a little bit less direct, so forth. But I think that's sort of what, agency can usually be boiled down to. And I think so much of our digital world has been built around kind of deliberately not giving choice, because
Right.
in fact, oftentimes humans don't like making choices. We kind of like being told what to watch. It's why a news feed or why a continuous scroll is so effective. It's why nudging or, opting out versus opting in are like such effective digital strategies to coerce certain behavior. And I get that. I get that, why that's evolved the way it has. But I think fundamentally, like, choice has not often been built into the DNA of digital systems or kind of tech ecosystems.
Aside from the kind of privacy characteristics of agency, or let's call it context and control, I think there's another emerging idea, which is around portability, reusability, like ownership, for lack of a better term, where people are starting to realize that, my books that I bought in Amazon, I don't actually really have, or the movies that I bought in Google, I don't actually have, or the data that I've kind of built up in one place, I can't use in another place. One of the things that gets us excited about the crypto architecture is that when you own your identity in a more direct way, you can take components of your digital identity with you into different places. And we're sort of still at the scratching the surface of experiences that feel magic because of that. But I do think there's a magic user experience that can be associated with agency. I get probably most excited about it around portability and reuse of, and interoperability and the ability to maybe connect my digital self on my own terms, which is related to privacy. But I think there's something there too.
I could easily have added to that list of, consent and control, ownership or custody. I think the idea of custody has become a kind of like interesting animating concept, especially in crypto and Web3, but kind of carries over in lots of domains. I think one of the things I've been struck by as I've spent more time in the space is the ways in which like the earliest visions of the internet by the kind of OG internet pioneers, the Tim Berners-Lees of the world, etc., was as a highly distributed system that was like user owned and user controlled, in which there was an enormous amount of portability and interoperability, etc. And how far we've moved away from that vision. And I think we can argue about what were the drivers of the shift away. And I'd be curious to hear what you think. But I think it's a combination of, kind of operating system lock-in and the kind of move to the cloud where no longer, is your device, your sort of digital universe that you own. It's probably partly the subscription economy. And it's probably just the volume of data and how it's proved to be so valuable from a monetization standpoint that has driven certain business models that make that early vision, unappealing to a lot of companies. And yet it feels to me like there's now a whole kind of generation of founders and entrepreneurs who are rethinking those assumptions and also perhaps, a new generation of technological tools that make that original vision more possible. In a way that it just wasn't because of technological challenges and latency, all these things. And now maybe there's like a new dawn for those ideas.
I think that's exactly right. And I think about it a little bit in terms of Web 1.0 had, let's call it sovereignty or more agency, more kind of ownership and control over your technology. Mm-hmm. Like you ran a server, you had an email, server, you ran a domain name, you would deploy some software. But what it lacked was connectivity and distribution. Everything was scattered and separated. And so it was hard to make things useful and connected. And what did Web 2 do is it said, actually, if we put everything together on our server, you can get so much more out of it. You can get eyeballs. You can fork and remix more easily when it comes to content or code or writing or whatever. And there's so much convenience and so much interest that was unlocked by that, let's call it sort of centralizing force, because there was no other way to accomplish those goals in Web 2 other than giving one or more companies kind of control over like a bottleneck where they could put things together. I think that's maybe opening up today in some ways, which I think is exciting.
And ideally, maybe we get to a state of the world where you can have both, right? Where you can have that kind of connectivity and collaboration that was enabled by a more networked, more, connected environment, and also have some of that portability and ownership and find business models that can support that. I think that's one area where I feel optimistic, but it does require some like wholesale rethinking of our relationship with software and infrastructure and each other.
I'd love to go back a little bit in terms of this idea and also your journey through it. There's a bunch of steps along the way. The beginning of the internet, these sort of encryption wars in the 90s, Cambridge Analytica, I don't know, Russia and the 2016 election, TikTok. Like there's been a whole history of moments that have at times kind of crystallized this idea. I'm curious, like, where did this start to click for you, and what kicked off your journey thinking about all these things?
When I like really think about, why is it that I think about the world in this particular way and what were all the kind of formative moments and threads that I pulled on? Some of it I think goes back like really early into childhood. And this has nothing to do with tech per se, but I grew up in a family that is all sort of working in creative industries and the art world. I think frankly, growing up around a lot of contemporary art has, kind of pushed me to just like think differently about underlying premises, like what is art. One of my father's favorite anecdotes is that when I was like 4 years old, we were walking around in New York City and I encountered a giant, pile of trash, as one does in New York City. And And I was like, Dad, is that an installation? And he was like, no, but bravo, and that was like the way that my, giant pile of, like, why can't that
What a
be
statement.
art?
Right.
Like what,
Yeah.
what is art? Like, and I would like that. I grew up thinking art looks weird and it kind of challenges what you think of things. That's been very formative in how I've like shown up in these different sectors or industries and been like, but wait, like, does it have to be that way?
Right.
So I really credit my parents with that. And also just, I think feeling very empowered to pursue a career that was motivated entirely by interest and passion and what I love, as opposed to, what seems practical or whatever. Another, I think, kind of formative experience, as I was kind of thinking about this, is that my younger sister is adopted from China. My family went to China in 1998, to pick her up. And that was a very formative trip for me as a child. I think I realized the extent to which a particular foreign policy regime and geopolitical moment shaped my family, the fact that my sister became a member of my family, and that also can change over time. And so this kind of like really personal connection to like geopolitical forces that are kind of outside of your home and feel often very distant, I think has also been very kind of present in my life. It certainly also has sparked an interest in China itself and the ways in which that country has evolved and thought about controlling its population in different ways,
Sure.
and so forth.
And its technology, right?
And its technology, right. And so I think in some ways that also, has probably contributed to the way that I think about the world. But I think more directly to kind of like answer your question about like when some of this just stuff started like clicking. I've spent most of my career in investing, but in sort of different stages in different sectors. And I worked for a couple of years at the World Bank, ended up doing a number of deals and work in conflict zones, and, spent time in places like Somalia and Liberia during the Ebola crisis and South Sudan. And even though I was usually there with an investor hat on, looking at a particular investment or deal or whatever, I became very interested in the ways that technology was being used in all of those different environments, and both in ways that were quite oppressive and manipulative and kind of surveillance-y, and also the ways that tech could be quite empowering. I spent some time living in Iraq during the period in which Mosul was being retaken from ISIS. And at that point in time, like the best source of information on the ground was a Twitter account that was authored by somebody anonymously in Western Mosul. And that was like the source of truth. It was also the ways in which people communicated using more secure communication channels, like a Signal of the world, doing things like mining Bitcoin. I think for me, that set off a bunch of light bulbs, but it also sort of stayed in the back of my head. That it didn't feel like there was something particularly actionable there, but it certainly, I think for me, helped to connect some of the dots between the ways in which technology could contribute to a more kind of democratic and flourishing society, or one that was going to be more controlling and more manipulative. So that was a big one too.
A lot of the examples you mentioned, and I hear similar stories from other people, have to do with some direct experience in a place, a part of the world where something about the architecture of technology is either missing or broken or clearly oppressive, which causes you to notice that. And you hear similar things with finance and money supply and currencies, and also with technologies. A lot of the early sort of crypto people were coming from places with high inflation or capital controls, or other real broken like currency problems. Certainly, anyone who's lived under some version of state surveillance or experienced it is, going to have a closer feel for something like Signal or other kinds of encryption or decentralized communications. The fact that that's so also represents some sort of barrier between an understanding of those dynamics and like a mainstream adoption and mainstream caring. For instance, the U.S. today, I would say there's more attention paid to these kinds of things than there was 5 years ago, especially because of the last election and sort of the legislation around TikTok and the idea that there can be let's call it foreign interference in our digital lives. And even with all of that, I'm not sure how much people really care on their day-to-day. Everybody's still on TikTok. So I'm curious how you think about that as a problem and an opportunity today, about like what makes people care about this, or what might make them care.
I think it's absolutely true that, when I talk to folks, in the US usually about something like privacy or kind of like digital rights, people often respond by saying, yeah, Google probably knows everything about me, but like, who cares? Right? Like, it doesn't matter. And I will say, and I, first of all, I get that. I totally get that. I also think that it's really easy to take privacy for granted when you live in a relatively mature, stable democracy where you're kind of like, I don't know, maybe the NSA is reading my text messages, but like, I don't really care that much. And I think that isn't the case for many, many people around the world for whom somebody getting access to their private text messages could in fact be like a life or death situation, or have life or death stakes. I think Americans maybe have gotten a little bit of a taste for that in realizing that some of their data could be used to identify pre-existing health conditions and jeopardize their ability to get insurance. I think in the wake of Roe falling, realizing that, depending on what state you live in, the type of information you're tracking on your phone could potentially be weaponized against you. So I think all of a sudden there's like been a little bit of like a clicking of like, oh wow, like maybe this stuff does matter even in a mature, stable democracy. But I would like to think that we'll continue to live in a society where ideally you could take your privacy for granted, right? But I'm not sure that we can take that for granted forever. And yet, as an investor, I do have to think about the fact that I might, in the US and maybe also, in parts of Europe, depending on where you are, don't care about privacy and are not willing to pay for it. And so it does influence, what we think are going to be businesses in 2024. That's not to say that that might not change in 10 years from now. Who knows? As a result, that often means that a kind of pure play consumer product that requires a user to be particularly vigilant about their security or safety, like, is sometimes a really tough sell, for exactly this reason. That being said, I think there's lots of tools and products out there where the outcomes are really good for end users, even if they're not the customer or the one paying. And there's a lot of incentives for enterprises to perhaps make that privacy or data or information more secure for their own reasons. But it is like this big question of like, how do you make people care? That is maybe slightly a tech problem, but it's really like a social psychology problem more than anything else. And I think it's going to be a generational difference too. Like, I think there's segments of Gen Z that are so overexposed and have never known anything different. And there's also some that are kind of back, experiencing a bit of a backlash and reverting to flip phones. And so I don't totally know like where the story goes, but you have kids. I'd be curious, like what you see among a younger generation.
I was just thinking about my teenage kids who are both largely online. So they're, in middle school and high school. And I think they're more on the side of maybe I don't want this in every aspect of my life. And I think are growing up with a little more sensitivity around, oh, look, you're taking my photo, or I know I'm being tracked when I leave the house by my parents, on Find My Phone or whatever it is. And so I think there is a generational shift that can be at play. I like this frame of looking at the different shocks and the different pressures that are pushing things one way or another. Like the other, like very, very big one that's happened in the last couple of years is Gen AI, that has caused people broadly, every kind of person, to actually stop and think about, wait a second, what's happening here with technology? How do I feel about it? Versus just blindly going forward with it, like more or less what happened with social media. Don't get me wrong, everybody's going blindly forward with Gen AI, but I think it is causing a stop and think moment, which is probably good.
There's many larger unanswered questions about AI, but one of them is like whether or not there's a world in which we could own our own training data. Is there a world in which you can decide and control how much of your information and data and likeness and voice and characteristics you choose to share with a machine learning system or a training data set or your own personal AI, et cetera, and a copilot, or whether or not you would have the ability to determine the kind of guardrails on that and revoke access or not. And I think we actually don't know yet, right? And probably the cynics among us would say, oh, it's too far gone. Our data has already been scraped and used in all these different training data sets. And that's true to some extent, but I still think that's unanswered and we haven't quite figured that out yet.
We're sitting on a bunch of things, a bunch of primitives that are about to make something new possible. We've got sort of AI tools. There's privacy tech like zero knowledge proofs and all these other things that are becoming more useful than ever. Crypto is there as a back end and a mechanism for owning digital assets in a new way. Then you've also got like emerging patterns on the business side, platforms or maybe individuals cutting deals with model companies, and then maybe a bunch of legislative changes that are brewing because of all this. It creates a kind of a funny moment where a whole lot of brand new is possible, but it's not exactly clear how the pieces are going to fit together. In the book, Where Good Ideas Come From, which this podcast is named after, there's this idea of the adjacent possible, which is like, so what can happen today because of those tools that are on the desk at the moment? Obviously, that tool set unleashes maybe a whole bunch of questions, but also a whole bunch of opportunities. And I'm just curious of that set or maybe other things, like which are the ones that you're most focused on right now as being exciting doors to open on this path?
One thing that I've been thinking about a lot recently is that there's been a particular kind of movement and push, I think, in recent months around wanting to accelerate the development of AI and not have guardrails around it. And often part of that is justified on national security grounds, right? Like the argument goes something like, if we create too many regulations or guardrails around AI, then we're going to be too slow and China's going to win and the US is going to lose, and that's bad. And that's usually kind of like where the sentence stops. And I find that a little bit unsatisfying because it doesn't fully complete the thought, right? Like presumably like the whole reason that we want, the United States to win the AI race is that we want the version of AI that is out there in the world to be embedded with a certain set of democratic values. And that could be things like respect for property rights, including intellectual property. Maybe it's around commercial accessibility, right? That it's not a state-owned asset, but that there's lots of, kind of open source possibilities and the ability to transact, right? That could be a democratic value that's embedded. Also, like something that's relatively privacy preserving, like that. But whatever they are, we can argue about like what is in that list. Like arguably, like that's what we want to see in the world. And I'm hard pressed to think that all of those things will just sort of manifest entirely organically without, like thoughtfulness and consideration. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the solution is regulatory, right? Or that it's like, legal guidelines, but I think it requires intention. And maybe some of that is like self-imposed thoughtfulness from within companies themselves about how they're building. I think we're seeing that from, some foundation model companies more than others. When I think about what are the possibilities for AI and agency, there's both the question of like, how can it advance our agency? And I think, part of that is like all the creative possibilities of pairing a human with, an AI research assistant or a Gen AI tool, et cetera, that are really exciting. And then also this question of how do you embed that agency into how you build these systems from the bottom up?
So does that make you an accelerationist or a decelerationist or something in the middle?
I sort of like reject that framing. Like, I just don't think it's very helpful. What is the end goal that we're working towards? And I don't know that that's always discussed or defined, right? I'm also like very confident in like US competitiveness right now in AI. And I think there's a lot of data that shows that, the number of new startups that are working in the space in China is really dropping out, whatever. Like we can talk about that sort of thing too. I just find that to be not a particularly useful framing, if I'm being honest.
I agree. And at the same time, I struggle to put my finger on where's the most leverage in inserting the kinds of values that you're describing, because I think in an ideal world that we'd land exactly there, right, where we can move fast and accelerate the benefits of this new technology, which is like magic in a lot of ways, and I think has the potential to increase human knowledge and capabilities and solve really important problems, while at the same time inserting those values in the most reasonable way.
But I think one of the ways you can insert those values might be like investing in a company that both makes it, I mean, we've been talking about IP and copyright, so maybe that's like an easy one to think about, but like a company that allows for the easy transacting of enormous amounts of data that might not be exchanged otherwise, but to also do it in a way that is, transparent and auditable and, compensates the right people, right? Like, I think you can do that in ways that are not, that are not just regulation, which is, I think, where people's brain often goes is like, oh, the only way to like dictate outcomes must be like government action. But like, actually, there's a lot of ways to put your finger on the scale.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that's why we're both working on investing in startups, because we believe that one of the best ways to advance any agenda is to get lots of small teams, new teams building new things that are moving in that direction. And at the same time, I think there's going to be like, this is so profound and so front of mind that the US government's going to be doing more, among others, be doing more things in the next, couple, like really short term, that has an impact on it. As an investor, do you find that you also need to be spending time in the policy arena on this stuff, or do you think it's mostly about putting your money where your mouth is and funding things?
On the investing side, I would say that I generally, am not trying to make bets that rely on there being regulatory action or tailwinds. Like, I might have a sense directionally of like where things are going in terms of data privacy regulations or whatever. But I think making bets on timing there and outcomes is really, really hard. And so solutions that are really going to take off, if there is some sort of like regulatory outcome, I find really, really hard to bet on. That being said, I think it's totally worthwhile to be engaging in policy discussions and exchange of ideas, because I think I think folks who are decision makers could benefit from hearing the perspective of people who are working on the cutting edges of this in industry. I think founders themselves need to be aware of the environment that they're operating in and the possible both headwinds and tailwinds for their business that might arise in the future at some indeterminate date, right? I think it's totally worthwhile depending on, what your strategy is.
The technology that's getting developed right now, including AI, including crypto, including other things, is getting developed much more in the public eye and with a political spotlight than previous generations. When email and HTTP were getting invented, nobody was paying attention. When Google was launching and even when social media and mobile, it was just happening. And then scrutiny came later. But it's very interesting to be investing in technologies that everyone recognizes as being important and also political at the earliest stages of their development. So I feel like in a lot of ways we're entering somewhat of a new world of investing in internet technology because of that scrutiny.
I totally agree with that. I would go even further and say there's been a whole class of really, really powerful technological tools that were largely developed, kind of in secret, right? Like in classified settings in DARPA or at the DoD, et cetera. And were in highly controlled environments. I'm thinking of even like nuclear technology, right?
Sure.
Where access to those tools was highly mediated and highly controlled. And part of what makes, I think, AI so different is that it is enormously powerful. And rather than being born secret, as some people say, it's born open. Like a lot of the development is happening literally in open source communities, but also like at tech companies that are not classified settings. And that's amazing from an innovation economy standpoint and accessibility and experimentation and all those things. But it also means that the risks are really diffuse. And somebody in potentially coding from their basement can have an enormous impact on many, many people around the world. And also means that it's subject to public scrutiny in a way that these kind of more either under the radar or secretive developments have happened, in generations past.
If you think about just crypto and AI as two profound technologies right now, they're both open source, more or less open source technologies, right? Like not every AI model is open source, but lots of them are, and they'll continue to be. And the cat's more or less out of the bag on the direction of research. And obviously it takes a big, well-funded company or government to train the biggest models, but the technology that's powering it is open technology. And so we're entering a world where profound technologies are open source and exist all over the world. And so people are going to pick them up and start building things with them. Stop it is a harder angle to take now versus react to it and figure out how to respond to it. Maybe to bring that whole line of thinking back to kind of your story and your journey through this, you didn't necessarily start out as an investor. You do have a background in investing, but you really had a lot of experience personally in more like the policy side of things. Like, how did you come to create Ex Ante and realize that this was the right way to express your interest?
I started with investing, and that was the toolkit. And then I realized that a lot of those outcomes were either dictated or influenced by these kind of larger macro developments, whether they're policy or geopolitical or whatever. And so I kind of did this foray into the policy side of the world, and then kind of found my way back to the investing side. Some of those experiences that, you're referring to include working on the 2016 Clinton campaign. Like, foreign interference in elections became a phrase and a topic that people became aware of during that election cycle. I think the sort of immediate impacts of social media on democracy became crystal clear to everybody. That was hugely formative. I also spent time working on an independent congressional commission called the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. And the commission was charged with trying to figure out what are the intersections of AI and national security, and what should the U.S. be doing with it? Everything from thinking about semiconductors and supply chains to lethal autonomous weapons. And what does that mean under the laws of, international humanitarian law and law of armed conflict and so forth. So lots of like big thorny questions. I'm going to credit Avishal Garg at Electric with influencing some of my thinking here, but we ought to think carefully about the ways that the underlying structure of technology lends itself to certain types of governments and societies. Arguably, you could say that AI in many ways is fundamentally an authoritarian type of technology because it relies on the mass collection and centralization of data.
Yep.
And so arguably entities, state governments or otherwise, that have the ability to collect and centralize that data may always have an asymmetric advantage. And that's not to say that the US and other democracies should not be investing in AI, that it can't be deployed in really great ways in the context of democracy. But I think it does challenge us to think a little bit about like, okay, well, what are the forms of technology that are like fundamentally reinforcing of like democratic systems? And I would argue it's probably technologies that are more distributed in nature. Spending time on the commission, I think, helped to connect a lot of those dots. But ultimately, as much as I have always, kind of loved the policy world and found it to be really intellectually stimulating, I think there's something really motivating about like having skin in the game and really
no doubt,
rolling up your sleeves and trying to encourage the change you want to see in the world. I think one way to do that is to get into public service. And another way to do that is, potentially building a company or working at one that you believe in. Or another way is helping to direct private capital towards the things that you want to see in the world. And that was the kind of investing piece of it was the tool that I had in my toolkit. But I think it's totally fair to say that there's a lot of different modes and approaches to tackling these problems. And this is just one of many approaches.
I love that. I have a very similar sort of path and journey, getting out there and building and having skin in the game and experimenting and just directing capital and trying things feels the most right for me, but it's definitely not the only way to have an impact on these issues. It does seem like that there's a core requirement just around being close enough to the technology to understand it, which feels so important right now and also so hard. And I really enjoy, as an investor, being very close to the people who are building, because they really help me get a sense of what's actually there and what's possible. And it also, I think, makes me continue to be kind of worried about how governments around the world will react to some of this technology, because some of it can be very hard to understand. We spend our whole working days trying to come to a point of view about some of these things that aren't so easy to wrap your head around. And a lot of these technologies also can cut both ways. Something like privacy preserving cryptocurrencies are, you could argue, are super agency enforcing and pro-democratic. And at the same time, they can lead to, illicit finance and catch the wrath of, law enforcement for good reasons. And all of a sudden you've got whole lot of tension around something. And it takes a lot to unpack that. And there's so much of that going on right now too, which is just going to continue to be a challenge for everybody building in this space.
I think technology can cut in both directions and both be enormously advancing of rights and agency and also potentially undermining of it. Some people, I think, often like to kind of fall back on like, oh, well, technology is neutral and it's just how people use it that, has outcomes. I actually don't buy that. I think like most technology out there is purpose built. Right? Like maybe that is in fact what distinguishes like technology from just science, right? Is that there's like this purpose built.
Yep.
And I think you can't divorce a technology and its tool from, the kind of either intended and unintended purposes behind it. I would like to think that groups of users can have the ability to kind of dictate those outcomes based on the values that they're trying to promote for the purposes of that community. I think to the extent that the ways things are built can facilitate more of that choice, like the better.
There's this tension between like privacy and control, let's say. And then there's another tension between agency and convenience, or convenience and entertainment. I think they both require trade-offs from different stakeholders. The privacy versus control has more to do with government, I think, and those in positions of authority, whereas agency versus convenience is maybe more of a personal choice. How do you feel about that tension as it sits today?
It's interesting that you juxtapose those things, because sometimes people do a different combination, which is like privacy and convenience. And
yep.
I think to me, yes, it's true that historically, perhaps the more secure, the more private way of doing something was more inconvenient. I don't think that necessarily has to be the case. I kind of like resist the idea that those things necessarily have to be opposed, but I do accept that, historically, they often have been, and people often opt for convenience, and that means not making choices. That means going with the defaults, et cetera. That's why it's even more important to invest in technologies where the default itself is pretty good.
The point about defaults makes a ton of sense. And I would maybe even take that a step further, where if we can imagine a world where the product experience is better, more magical, smoother, more buttery, more appealing, and it also happens to have these benefits around privacy and agency, I see examples of that on the horizon.
Yeah.
And to me, that's like the even better thing to be looking for.
What we might worry about is that we end up in a world of essentially, consent spam, where like you're constantly being greeted all the time with these like consent moments where you have to like make a decision about, do I share this or do I not? And it's like, that's really hard for a person to have to do. It's like hard to navigate your life. It's like, there's, if terms of service already are difficult to navigate, like try, multiplying that by 1,000. That's not the outcome I want to see. But I do think about possibilities of like, could you have some sort of AI agent that works on your behalf and knows your preferences, your lines in the sand, where you want to give consent, where you don't, where you care about sharing your data in a very kind of intuitive, way, and can kind of help deploy those preferences on your behalf, right? Like, wouldn't that be nice?
I like that. And we have a shared investment that hasn't launched yet, but that has some of these ideas baked in, right? Like you can imagine sort of an operating system or a programming environment or an application development environment that has some of these ideas fundamentally baked in at its core so that you don't have to think about it and you can just trust it. And it has these values baked in. It makes me think of a whole nother category of where there's a challenge around agency, which is around terms of service and what kinds of agreements are we getting into with tech companies and products as we use them. There was an article I think it was in the journal this morning about a couple who was in an accident in an Uber, and then they realized that because their daughter had ordered something on Uber Eats, they had done a click-through terms of service on arbitration, and they couldn't sue, and they were very surprised. And anyway, that's just like one example of, I think, a diminishment in agency that's a result not just of the technical architecture, but the legal architecture around the technology, and also are not understanding what it is. And so, what if that same AI agent that you just described could also go through all of my products that I use and read all the agreements and come back to me and explain to me what I'm actually subject to, and then, get me out of them or whatever, right? Like, I think there's a version of agency that has to do with harnessing technology that works for us to defend us a little bit against the technology that doesn't work for us. And I think that's a piece of this architecture that could come into focus if we're lucky.
Absolutely. And I'm not going to say too much about it now, but ex-ante has actually been working on a project that addresses or tries to address some of these issues around fundamental legal agreements, terms of service, et cetera, which we're excited to share more about later. But it is interesting to me how much terms of service have kind of like been in the news recently. There have been some high profile examples of tech companies like kind of like subtly and quietly changing their terms of service to enable training on data that maybe users are not aware of. And that's been now reported. But also, like there was substantial time during the FTX trial, for example, that was dedicated to the terms of service. And did users know what it meant? And did SPF know what it meant? And, and it's kind of wild that we like are in that world where these like agreements that people truly do not give a lot of thought to end up dictating a lot about outcomes and who's liable and what kind of rights you have and all those things. All these architectures that have kind of been created, I'm not going to say to deliberately like evade, user engagement, but like that's kind of been the outcome, could maybe be subjected to like new light because maybe we can have AI that helps us on the front end to identify some of those problems.
Right. Or new computing architectures. Like imagine that an individual were able to express their terms of service to the internet, right? Not the other way around.
And I wonder if, maybe we don't even have time to get into this, but it's like do business models need to change in order to support that? Like instead of, paying a subscription to that service provider, maybe what it really is that similar to paying your broadband or Wi-Fi bill every month, you're also paying like a compute bill. But once you pay for that, like then you get to have much more say over how you are using services that are part of that package. Very different way of thinking, but potentially is like a new model that unlocks a lot of possibilities.
Yeah, that's a real important point. I'm glad we got to talk about it because so much of the architecture of technology that we use every day is a result not only of the technology itself, but the business models that are possible and prevalent, right? And so most of the internet runs on an ad-based or a transaction-based business model. And then there are subcategories of software that operate on a subscription model. A lot of that enterprise, right? Like SaaS and, and if you look at for instance, any of the big AI companies and you compare what you get on the free plan versus what you get on the enterprise plan, you get a lot of protections on the enterprise plan about how your data is used and so on and so forth. Because guess what? You're paying for it. And so I think there's a fundamental question about whether such an architecture can be exposed to consumers who have a less of an ability to pay for such things, or if there's some minimal viable compute environment that can be, crafted around someone. I mean, the closest we have to it today, I think, is like you buy your phone from Apple and you pay for that and you get some version of that from Apple. There are a lot of problems with how Apple runs things, but I do think there's the beginnings of a little bit of a model like that there, that you could imagine something like that more cloud native.
Yep. I think the unfortunate thing is that users already are paying for these things, but they're paying via their data, right? Like they might not be paying in dollars per month, but they're paying in other ways, and maybe are not totally aware of that trade off. But it's tricky, like I think we've gotten very accustomed to getting a lot of services for free, and there's a lot of accessibility that's unlocked by that, and so I think we'd be remiss not to acknowledge those advantages, but it does come at a cost. And I think we are often not even aware of what the cost is.
For me, the big takeaway on this piece of it is just business model is so important. And big changes on the internet happen when a new business model is unlocked. I think this is part of what excites us so much about crypto is that it just unleashes a whole new category of business models. But I think we probably need to experiment on not just on the technology side, but on the business model side in order to unlock the level of agency that I think you're trying to get at here.
Totally. And I think the kind of traditional paradigms of the app store or a SaaS model are kind of old and boring at this point. Like there's got to be other more exciting
and what excites me is that there's room for new stuff. Like every once in a while, it feels like everything's been invented and everything's baked and done. And maybe it felt that way with social a few years ago. It's never true. And I think there's always something new coming, and that's what makes our job so exciting. Is that? And you made the point earlier about the generational change, which is I think a huge one. And that's a whole investment thesis on its own about what is the next generation going to value in their technology and media, and how can we bake these kinds of values into those products while we have time. I wanted to ask you one concluding question, not to put you in a box, but you sit in the middle of these really thorny questions about the future and our place in it and how we feel about it. As you sit here and you become aware of all the threats to personal agency and democracy, but also look at the opportunities maybe that are around. Like, do you consider yourself optimistic or pessimistic about where everything is heading?
I mean, definitely optimistic. I don't think the fund would be called ex ante if it weren't, right? The orientation of the fund has always been about like what is forward looking, what is future oriented. All the venture investors fundamentally have to kind of be optimists. So they're like, well, otherwise, like none of us could be in this business because you can always convince yourself that a particular startup or deal is not going to go well, right? So you have to kind of irrationally believe that it will all fall into place. I think, frankly, spending time with founders and builders who are thinking about the future and have really creative ideas about how to solve some of these problems gives me a ton of energy, and is part of what makes it usually pretty easy to be optimistic about the future.
Hear, hear. Zoe, thank you so much for being here today. This was a lot of fun, as always. I'm so excited to see what you continue to invest in at Ex Ante. I love getting a chance to get into your head and how you think about how the world is unfolding and how so many of these seemingly really, really, really hard problems, may have the beginnings of answers that we can pursue over time.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for being such a amazing sounding board and thought partner in a lot of these big questions. I really appreciate it.